It's called Power versus Force. And I was really impressed by reading that and learning some principles from it, something that we can apply to the problem that we are presented with in our vaccination freedom movement page. So yeah, that's the book, and it's written by David Hawkins. He is MD PhD. He passed away already. He was MD PhD, so he was a psychiatrist, and also he did a very interesting PhD research in human consciousness, very unusual topic, not something establishment likes to allow people to do, but he was a very special person. So he was, a contemporary of Linus Pauling, and they were both co-founders of orthomolecular psychiatry, where they say, well, drugs is not the way to go. So and that was back in the 60s, so he was really a pioneer. And on top of that, he was also a spiritual leader, so he covered a lot of ground in his life. The title of the book is so, grabbing. So what is power and what is force? So let's start with force. And here is one of the definitions in the book that I found about force. Maybe it will start getting familiar to you. So societal choices, more often than not, are the result of expediency, statistical fallacy, sentiment, political or media pressure, or personal prejudice and vested interest. Okay, so that sounds really familiar. And based on that, certain rules and regulations and mandates are put together and forced upon us. So that's how force manifests itself in our society. Now, so by contrast, what is power? And power is something that arises from meaning, and it has to do with principle. And if I were like to put the book aside and say, like, what is power? Well, I give you an example. When a human being can stop a tank, that's a power. So that happened in China, in Tiananmen Square. How can like a feeble human being stop a tank? There has to be some power present in there. And the same happened in Russia, for example. People, like human beings, they stopped army. They stopped the tanks to prevent the coup d'etat that was trying to reestablish the regime. And that was the last day of the Soviet Union, pretty much. So basically, there is something in there. And power is something that makes us tear when we recognize it, or it makes our jaw drop. And basically, this is something from above, and yet it manifests itself in these very powerful ways. So if you look at the history, and this is very well described in the book gives examples, but we're just looking in the history. What did human societies or human civilization has to go through? We went through many different types of injustices, discriminations of religious-based or racial-based or gender-based. And one by one, all of this was, overcome. Somehow society or some people in the society found within themselves a power to overcome that one by one. And we are living now at a time when there is one problem, right? We have, we overcome religious repression, racial, gender, but now we have this medical thing, like a medical dictatorship that exists here, or maybe we call it public health dictatorship, that is repressing our freedom to choose how to pursue our own health, right? And that includes vaccination, but it's more broad. It's also chemotherapy and all of that. So we live in this time, and we can look at this as, well, we are unfortunate to live at this time and deal with this headache, and go through these inconveniences that all these laws are trying to impose on us. Or we can look at it as the glass half full and say, well, this is a great time to live in because we can change. It's up to our generation to bring our society to the next level and to get rid of yet another level of discrimination, right? And establish that freedom once and for all. So that's how we can decide how we want to look at it, and how we see it. It will, of course, determine our actions and our success or failure. So let's look again at the vaccination, at the mandatory vaccination. So what does it represent? And that's a multiple choice question, right? Does it represent power or does it represent force? And I think everyone knows the answer by now. Anyone wants to volunteer to say? I think everyone knows it's B. Yeah, it's force. Because, I mean, if it wasn't force, then we wouldn't need regulations. We would all be lining up to get those vaccines. And so what does it mean? So if mandatory vaccination is a force, what it generates immediately, it's like a universal law that it generates a counter force. And we see that we have anti-vaccination movement. And it was always there from the very first vaccine that people were like against smallpox vaccine back in the past. It's not something new. So it's a counter force. And then, you know, as those who are on the side of counter force are making some advances and trying to win or establish some grounds, then the force gets more powerful, right? So then there are more repression, and then counter force is getting more powerful. I mean, more trying to. So it's basically it's a game, or it's a sort of like a struggle between the force and the counter force. And basically each one has a temporary, wins temporarily, and then, you know, another one takes over. So basically it's sort of going into the dead end. And this is what I'm seeing right now. This is what's happening, right? It's like they are tightening up exemptions. Well, our side is going to do something about it. Then they will again tighten it up even more. So how do we get out of this dead end, so to speak? How do we get out of this force counter force dance? And the way to do it is to elevate ourselves to the level of power. So stop being a counter force and start being a power. So how do we do it according to this book? And let's look at the example, historical examples. I just found this quote that really resonates with the book. So as I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'll still be in prison. So, okay, so that tells us something. So now let's see how we can use information in the book to find a way. And this is the major part of the book. This is the map of consciousness that Dr. Hawkins came up with. And if we look here in the middle, let's say this is the level of consciousness. He brings it down to a scale. It's like arbitrary scale, but it's a logarithmic scale. And so he puts certain levels of consciousness at the very bottom. So they are the weakest one. Starting with shame, guilt, apathy, grief, and everything else that you see. And all the way up to very empowering states of consciousness, or levels of consciousness, all the way up to enlightenment. So now you will see what you see here are two lines. There is a blue line and the red line. So everything that's below the blue line, so all these arrows that go down, all of these states represent the state of force. So, and all the emotions that accompany them. So basically, when we are in this state of consciousness and we are driven by these emotions to act, because usually it's emotions that make us act, do something, all of this results in force. It's a manifestation of force. So let's say you have anxiety, you act, you know, being scared, you do something based on fear, that's force. If you hate something or you're angry at someone, that's still force. And whatever regulations come up out of some people hating other people, that's going to be force. So the same with pride and scorn. Now, where does power show up? The power makes its first very weak appearance above the blue line. So that would be courage. That's where it's a tiny bit of, power. And because it's just above the force, it would take a lot of courageous people to overcome, you know, the force that is pretty much the majority. And the majority, you know, of the society or of humanity is below this blue line. That's how it is. So, but as any individual moves higher and higher on this ladder, they basically, when someone is high here, even one person can overbalance in their effect on the society, all the ones that are below, because this is a logarithmic scale, basically, in how much more power you gain with each accession of this ladder. Basically, now I think this ladder gives us an idea, or at least it gave me some ideas. Why is it that we don't seem to be making much progress in our vaccination freedom? And so we somehow have to find in ourselves a way to elevate ourselves. Basically, if you want this freedom to manifest itself, we have to elevate ourselves and get above this blue line.